Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com.
Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. Smell is arguably the least understood and appreciated of our senses. It's woven into the emotional reality of our lives in ways that we are just beginning to understand. When we talk about something passing the quote-unquote smell test, we're expressing something visceral that precedes thinking or analysis. Unlike all other sensory information that goes through the brain center, the thalamus, smell gets a through pass directly to the brain. Joining me today to talk about smell is neuroscientist Alex Wiltschko, CEO of Osmo.ai. Osmo is a Google spin-off whose mission is to enable computers to smell. Alex is a repeat entrepreneur who spent much of his career exploring new frontiers in artificial intelligence and neuroscience. He's co-founded 2 significant startups in AI and was an industrial-strength machine learning engineer at Google prior to his founding Osmo. So he's had quite a career already. And I predict that the best is yet to come. I can smell it. Alex, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's going to be a lot of fun, I'm sure.
Indeed. Smell is something that has fascinated me for a long time. I was telling you, I hitchhiked from Kabul to London in the 70s, and, I associated smells with cities, and, particularly Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, smells of breads. It's interesting how that's lingered on. Let's start by, you telling us a little bit about yourself and, your personal journey till this point.
Certainly. I think if one thing is going to come out in our time speaking together, it's that I'm pretty into scent in the sense of smell. That's been a thread throughout my entire life. So I grew up in Texas, a town called College Station, which is on the smaller side. It's a university town. So my parents were professors. My dad studied geology, my mom public health. I just was always drawn and obsessed with certain things. I think that's kind of one of my defining personality traits is that, I'm not interested in lots of things. I'm obsessed with some things. And so that was computers from a very, very early age. So they were always around the house. My dad was a mainframe operator in the 70s. And so we always had computers. And so that was something that just seeped into my consciousness basically from before I could talk. And then perfumes came around. And I was always sensitive to smell. My dad was always a very good cook, and we always had nice smells around. And I remember, barbecue and wood fires and the smells of rainstorms in Texas. I mean, there's just all kinds of really vivid scent memories that I have. But I found this book called Perfumes, the Guide by Luca Turin. And it's basically just a bunch of one-paragraph reviews of perfumes. And the reviews are almost poetry. Luca Turin is an incredibly gifted perfume critic and an incredibly gifted writer, and it just grabbed me, right? The idea that there was this thing that was a smell that could give rise to such vivid language and experiences and recollections, but at the time I was 12, I had access to none of these perfumes. So it was like this fantasy world of like all these magical, mythical, alchemical potions that somehow could create these feelings that he was writing down. And then I was at TJ Maxx. I think we were like buying jeans for school or something like that. It's like a discount store in Texas. And on sale, to the degree that I could afford it as a 12-year-old, was one of those perfumes. It was a Zaro Pour Homme. I remember seeing it. I remember there was like layers of stickers at the discount from $70 to $50 to $30 to $12 to $7. And I bought it and I was just blown away. Like the description in this book was what I was experiencing, right? So it was this link between language and emotion and this liquid art of perfumery. And I was hooked. And so that's where I started collecting these perfumes to the extent that I could. So Amazon.com had selling items that was more than just books. It was like they were including also perfumes and whatnot. And so I started buying the perfumes that I could afford and just really experiencing the time course of these works of art. And I came to appreciate that they are indeed these works of art that unfold over time. Now, I was in Texas and not in southern France, the birth of perfumery. So I didn't know I could become a perfumer. I didn't even think about it. Just like, you watch a movie and you don't think you can become a director or an actor. Some people do. It just didn't occur to me. And that was kind of where I left it. It was just this obsession. So computers and perfume. And then over time, I realized how little we knew about smell. I had gained a fascination for neuroscience, and then I was led back to smell. And so that's kind of, there's this braiding motion of computers and smell. Well, I'll leave one and come back to the other, and leave another and come back to the first one. And now where I am at Osmo, which is a company that's on a mission to give computers a sense of smell, those braids have actually combined for the first time in a way that I think is sustainable and something I hope to do for the rest of my life.
Fascinating. That's fascinating that you're actually involved in it as a kid. What was the language that he was using in that book to describe these perfumes? How did you identify with that language?
It was really evocative, like almost poetry. We could pull up some of the reviews if you wanted to, but they were very short and succinct. Some of them were just incisive, right? 1-star reviews that were just punishing, right? I'd never seen somebody write about anything with such invective sometimes, and just like such dripping disdain for the 1-star reviews, and then such soaring praise and descriptions of like true sublimity when experiencing just juice in a bottle, right? So it was the range with which she was writing, and the not just like the emotional range, but also just the linguistic kind of adeptness that he had in expressing himself. So,
and this one that you picked up, was it one of the ones he described in glowing terms?
Yes. I mean, I'm fascinated with quality, right? So things that are the best that they can possibly be. And I was fascinated with these 5-star perfumes, right? And like since then, I've developed my own taste, and things that he didn't think are 5-star, I think are fantastic. And I have perfumers I particularly enjoy, but I focused on the ones that he thought were the best, because I hadn't really developed my taste at 12.
Yeah. Have you read this book called Perfume? I'm assuming.
Yeah. I think it's a really beautiful and evocative picture into the life of somebody who's so exquisitely sensitive to smell, but not just that, but also knows how to construct smell. And so I'll tell you, like reading that book, the main character, is it Grenouille? Grenouille, yeah. Grenouille. Absolute monster, right? Yeah, I mean, a true twisted monster with an incredible gift. But like, one of the things that's amazing about that book is just not only can he smell everything, but he knows how to construct. So he can not only read the olfactory world, he can construct into it, and create experiences. And that is true fiction, right? Like to be able to choose an emotion and then move towards it with the rapidity that this fictional character can, that's not real. I think it could become real with automation and algorithms and data and artificial intelligence. And we hope to use that for very, very good ends. And not just that it feels good, but also that it's, we make smells that are better for the environment, et cetera, which we can get into. But it's just so vivid and so evocative, the descriptions of smell in that book.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's, I'd always been interested in smell. I love to cook myself. I'm a cook, and so aromas play a big role in my life. But that book it just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've been trying to get a hold of the author, Patrick Susskind. I'd love to have him on the podcast.
Oh, that would be awesome.
But I believe he's a complete recluse.
Oh, I see.
And so he's sort of disappeared somewhere in Bavaria, and he's like impossibly difficult to find.
I see. And I think the book wasn't originally in English as
well.
It was in German. It was in German, yeah.
Das Parfum.
So, yeah, I wonder if you could interview him in German and have a translator. If you can find him.
If I can find him.
March to wherever it is that he lives.
Yeah. So, Alex, broadly, what role does smell play in our lives?
Oh, boy. I think what we're learning, unfortunately, after COVID, and people's sense of smells sometimes are being taken away, sometimes being returned, sometimes not. We're learning just how important smell is. And there's a few ways, just prosaically, that it's a part of our life. And, those have to do with food, right? So 90% of what we call flavor is smell, right? So you can do a little experiment where you buy a jelly bean, hold your nose, your thumb on your right nostril, and I'm holding it right now. You can hear my voice changing. And your index finger on your left nostril, and then put a jelly bean in your mouth, and you taste nothing. You taste the sweetness, but you don't taste the lemon or the orange or whatever it is, right? And if you close your eyes when you do it, you can't see the color, so you don't know what it smells like. The moment you unpinch your nose and the vapors from that jelly bean flood backwards, it's called retronasal olfaction, flood backwards into the back of your nose and back through your front, you immediately know what jelly bean flavor it is.
Backwards, you mean from the inside?
From the inside, right? So there's a chimney effect when you chew food, which is you put food in your mouth, and then as you chew it, it produces vapors. And if your mouth is closed, those vapors are only going up. They're going up the back of your throat, and the only place for them to go is into your nose. And so it's the opposite direction of when you're breathing in air through your nose. That's how you experience flavor. 90% of it is going to be your sense of smell giving you that richness and that really the kind of higher dimensional aspect of food. Now, your tongue is doing a whole lot, right? Texture is doing a whole lot, but the richness of flavor is almost all smell.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading some similar example that bacon without smell just tastes like salt.
Absolutely. So a jelly bean without smell is just sweet, right? And coffee is just bitter, right? You don't actually want to drink coffee unless you have the smell and the aromas, right? It's not that great.
Yeah. To what extent are notions of, what's pleasant or aversive cultural?
Hugely. So there's going to be some aspects of smell that are innate. So this is true for flavor, right? So if you put something sour in a baby's mouth, they're going to make a face, right? Or bitter, they're going to make a scrunchy face and reject it. So of chemical perception, right? So here I'm lumping in taste on the tongue, kind of nose filling, the trigeminal nerve, and smell. But there are innate responses that exist, and some of those innate responses are really, really old and actually go back to species before humans. But a lot of what we consider to be good or bad can be learned, right? So in some cultures, Parmesan cheese is just awesome. And in others, people perceive the butyric off note or the butyric note, which is vomit-like, right? And don't experience it as pleasurable. Same with kimchi. Same with a lot of fermented foods. There is kind of a decay aspect to many foods in many cultures that you learn to like, right? And if you haven't learned to like it, you're not going to like it. Sometimes by default. So whether or not that's innate, I don't know the answer, but certainly our hedonics, which is a fancy word for do we like it or not, are affected by culture, they're affected by experience.
Yeah, I recall being in Bern, Switzerland for the first time during that same hitchhiking trip and going with my host with whom I was staying to the cheese shop to pick up some cheese for a fondue, and I almost passed out from the smell. So clearly the uber stinky delicacies just aren't my thing. So Alex, I read somewhere that people don't understand the importance of smell in their lives and tend to devalue it considerably relative to the other senses. I heard somewhere that apparently in a survey, men commonly said they'd gladly give up smell for hair. What's the deal here? Are we just unaware or underappreciative of smell because it's so invisible?
I think that's the case. It's really hard to know. I mean, you might imagine I have a big chip on my shoulder around the importance of smell. And so the predominant viewpoint out there is smell's not that important. That's obviously false, right? It's deeply important. In fact, if you lose your sense of smell, for reasons we don't really understand, all-cause mortality goes up. Right? Like you die more if you can't smell. We don't really know why that is. That might be because you can't detect danger or food spoilage or other signals that might, cause you to be harmed. But smell is deeply, deeply important. And in general, life just gets kind of gray. So there's all kinds of results that we're learning, unfortunately now due to COVID, because of how much COVID-induced anosmia or lack of smell, a loss of smell there's been. But in general, like what I have to dig up the exact study, but if you lose your sense of sight, your quality of life declines very rapidly immediately, and then it climbs back up again. Right? You learn to live with it. If you lose your sense of smell, nothing really happens to your quality of life immediately, but it declines over time slowly, progressively and your life gets worse because you're losing all the joy that comes with food or that comes with really just the experience of identity of your loved ones. Like a hug with somebody that you love is not the same without smell. And these are really subtle things that we don't really know how to talk about very openly as a society, but are kind of woven into the emotional reality of our lives.
That's fascinating what you just said. I hadn't realized this before, but, smell doesn't figure at all in our health checkups, right? You check eyesight, you check hearing. We don't check smell at all. And what you just said, if you lose your sense of smell, life just goes downhill steadily. And you may not even realize that may be a cause of it. I mean, I've heard people say, yeah, my smell is off or something like that. And it's just sort of a offhand remark. But I hadn't actually thought about the long-term consequences of the loss of smell that we may not actually be even aware of.
And I think we're waking up to it slowly. If we could speculate as to why smell has gotten a bad rap, that maybe goes all the way back to Aristotle. Maybe we check in with Darwin as well. I mean, there's been lots of truly foundational thinkers who I don't think have given smell its proper respect, as it were.
And I guess there really haven't been any scientific studies, on this kind of thing, right? Like, does a large-scale study where you actually are measuring people's quality of lives and you're measuring their olfactory sense. I mean, I don't think any of this stuff.
There's been a smattering of it with COVID. I think that we'll be learning a lot more over time, especially the long-term effects of anosmia. I mean, a lot of people who lost their sense of smell got it back in 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. Some people didn't. And some people had, parosmia or phantosmia where they had, permanently transformed senses of smell. And these are debilitating, right? Truly debilitating. Like an example is, your loved one all of a sudden smells like cigarettes every time you are near them, and they don't smoke, right? And you don't like that smell. How do you have a relationship with that person that is unchanged and that is remains positive if they smell, right? It is, maybe we're going too far down this road, but like the emotional impact and reality of smell is so much deeper than people appreciate.
Is smell fundamentally tied to emotion?
In a way, we can say that it is in a direct way. If we look at the neuroanatomy, if we look at how the wiring of our sense of smell is hooked up in the brain, every other sense has to go through multiple way stations before it reaches your cortex, which is, the areas of the brain that are on the outside. That's the wrinkly parts that we typically think as where information is associated and where, information can be brought together and be made conscious. Every other sense has to go through the thalamus and maybe multiple other way stations before it reaches the cortex or other associative areas like the hippocampus or areas of emotion like the amygdala. What's interesting about smell is it skips all of that. And so you perceive smell, a molecule enters your nose, it hits what's called the olfactory epithelium, which is kind of like it's the sensor, right? It's like the retina in the eye, it's the epithelium in the nose. That information goes one hop to a place called the bulb, the olfactory bulb, and then it goes right to the amygdala. Skips everything else. Right? So it's a direct jacked in line to your emotional centers, and it goes to the hippocampus as well, which is a center of memory in the brain. So you have a direct jacked in line to memory with smell as well, which I think explains the, overpowering emotional aspect and overpowering memory aspect of smell.
Fascinating. So let's get into the science of it, right? What do we actually know about smell? And one of the things you actually, when I asked you about your sort of personal journey, I guess you didn't tell us about how Osmo was actually formed and what you were doing at Google. So give us a little bit of that background, and then I just want to segue into the science of it. Like, how should we try and understand?
Sure. So I'll tell you kind of my, scientific training story interwoven with my pursuit of the problem. So I came to graduate school and I went to Harvard Medical School because that's where all the smell people were, right? At Harvard generally, and then I studied with a guy named Professor Bob Data, and he had trained under Richard Axel, who got the Nobel Prize along with Linda Buck for discovering the specific gene family of the olfactory receptor. So finding the genetic basis in the molecular biology basis of how we smell, right? True breakthrough. So Bob came to run a lab from Richard's lab. And what I studied with Bob was olfactory-driven behavior. So I originally really just wanted to understand smell, and then we found this interesting set of results around understanding the structure of behavior, and so we kind of got sidetracked. And that's kind of where I left smell for a while. So I came in to study smell. I ended up going in a different direction and understanding, thinking about how behavior is structured. And then I left academia to do startups. I got very, very lucky to also be mentored informally by a guy named Ryan Adams, Professor Ryan Adams, and he started a company called Wet Lab. And with there were 4 machine learning professor types, and then I was just hanging around, and I had built websites. I had written code before. Again, I was like programming from a young age, so I was very, very lucky to be included in that. We ended up building that, sold it to Twitter.
No. At that time, did you already have your PhD?
No, actually, I finished my PhD on nights and weekends. I worked at Twitter for 6 months while I was kind of finishing the PhD. And then my last paper came out like 4 years later. So it was my PhD, although it, was ostensibly, 5-ish or 6 years, it dragged on for maybe about 10, if you kind of count the last paper that came out of it.
And what was your thesis on, just out of curiosity?
Understanding the structure of mouse behavior. So we took the term body language as literally as we possibly could and tried to decipher the parts of speech of mouse body language. And it turns out there is a finite alphabet of, we call them behavioral syllables, that a mouse can use, the ways it can move its body, in order to reach all of its goals. And syllables are very rarely created or destroyed. So it turns out in the normal course of just a mouse moving around for an hour, it does all the motions it could do. And when a mouse is given a drug, or you alter its genetics, or you alter its environment, you don't create new behaviors. You actually just rebalance how often it uses these behaviors. And what that allows you to do is look at the frequency of all these syllables as a kind of behavioral fingerprint. And that fingerprint tells you what's going on in that mouse's brain. And it turns out, and this is work that Professor Dutta has continued in his laboratory, that fingerprint is super useful for actually understanding how the brain itself organizes and structures behavior. So that was what I spent my 20s thinking about and working on. And the gateway to it was olfaction. So we wanted to understand, how does the smell of a fox scare a mouse? And these mice are, after 100 years of inbreeding, still scared of that smell. How do we really understand that? And that led naturally to, okay, well, what does it mean to be scared? How do we observe that? How do we quantify that? And I got obsessed. And I went, again, I'm very obsessive on certain topics once they grab me.
And that's sort of woven into their DNA, I guess. They're just born with this. This is innate, this fear of...
It seems to be innate, and people are still chasing down the gene circuits and the neural circuits that support that fear. But it is one of these kind of little hacks that you can use to try to uncover innate responses to or innate behavioral responses to smell.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's back up and get to where we were.
Yeah. So I'll skip over the startup stuff, but I got
no. Don't skip over it. That's very interesting.
Okay. Cool. So Wet Lab was a machine learning as a services company. The idea was people were training ML models. It was just at that point okay to just say machine learning openly, and AI was a bad word. That was like a step too far.
Yeah,
it's very crazy that we can say AI and that is fine, and that statistics is now back to being boring. Or the words have changed, but regardless, we were an ML company, and we were we're kind of a meta ML company. When you train a machine learning model, there's all kinds of knobs you have to twiddle to get that model to work correctly. And we built a system that automatically tuned those knobs. That would help you deploy models faster in industry. And so Twitter bought us for the team and for the technology, and we helped apply deep learning really across the company. And that was really my first education in the application of artificial intelligence at an internet scale, at real practical problems. And so I learned an enormous amount in the almost 2 years I was there. And then I moved over to Google Brain, At the
So,
same
just a second
Yeah.
there. So, how much of your sort of that neuroscience background and all that work that you've done in school and subsequent to that was relevant to Twitter directly, or was it a whole new thing?
I mean, very little. Very little explicitly, right? I mean, what I learned how to do in my PhD was think critically, ask the right questions. I developed a taste for like what are interesting problems to work on and how to tell a story. Right? So that's actually something that I wish more people would learn in their PhD, which is facts are really great. Findings are great. Figures are great. The only way people consistently absorb information is if it's embedded in story form. It's the only way. Sketches are a little bit behind stories, but spreadsheets basically have no narrative content, and people don't remember them. So that's I think what I learned in the PhD. But all the practical skills of doing surgery and running behavioral assays and writing papers, like none of that was relevant.
How did you end up at Google then?
Yeah, I ended up at Google. Kind of in parallel, the PhD work that I did was spun out into a company, and that company ended up being sold to a biotech. And they use that technology to actually analyze the behavioral effects of their drugs in mice. And now those drugs are in the clinic, which I'm really, really proud of. And then that was kind of a thing that I worked on with Bob on the side. But then at Google, I was recruited in as a research scientist in what was called Google Brain, is now called Google DeepMind. And if you're a research leader in Google Brain, you're kind of set loose. It was a pretty free and open environment, and they say, go figure some stuff out. Go invent the future of AI and machine learning. And so, I had an interest from Twitter in tools for machine learning. So something I built at Twitter was called Torch Autograd. That plus Chainer basically were combined by Sumith Chintala to create PyTorch. And so I extended some of that work at Google Brain and built other systems for that. And I helped launch TensorFlow 2 in a very small way. And then, when I finished that, I felt like I'd kind of shed my imposter syndrome. I was really I was trying to prove to myself I could write code that gets shipped at Google, right? Like that was the thing I wanted to prove to myself. And once I did that and I kind of got over the feelings of imposter syndrome, I kind of came back to my love of understanding scent. And I took a little time to look around and understand what had been invented in the 5 or 6 or more years since I last really seriously tried to look at digitizing smell. And it turned out a lot had happened. What had happened is that machine learning had definitively entered the domain of chemistry and was working. So the thing that was preventing that from before was machine learning really likes rectangle-shaped input. It likes grids. It likes structured input like images and text and sound. Those are either linear structures or they're grid structures. Molecules are not grids. They are variable size. They have variable connectivity. There's different types of nodes. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why it's really hard to shove a molecule into a grid-shaped box. But this technology called graph neural networks had come online, and these neural networks take graphs as input. That seemed to blow the lid off of the possibilities of actually making progress in understanding scent with an AI toolkit. And it turned out that works really, really well. I would say the majority of the work had to do with data curation. Right? So I work with a really amazing team at Google Brain to do this. So Ben Sanchez, Brian Lee, Jennifer Wei, Wesley Chan, and then we added some other people as well. So Rick Gherkin was a visiting professor. Jake Yasonik was an intern with us. And we had a whole host of collaborators outside of the main group as well. Joel Mainland, particularly at the Monell. And what we did is we just tried to push the boundaries of what can machine learning do now that we have graph neural networks and now that we've actually spent an enormous amount of time curating a high quality data set.
What do you mean by curation here?
So there are data sets out there online that tell you this is the structure of a molecule and this is what it smells like to a perfumer, right? And there's multiple of these data sets. And each of those data sets alone isn't really big enough to do machine learning. And each of those data sets uses slightly different words to describe the smells of these molecules. So you have to do a pretty significant amount of work in order to align the taxonomies or the lists of words people use to describe smells. This is still a problem. There is no unified taxonomy of what things smell like, just like there's no unified taxonomy of what colors there are, right? There's the 64 crayon Crayola box, there's the Pantone set, there's CMYK art. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of talking about color. It's even worse. It's so much worse in smell. And so what we had to do is just agree, okay, we're going to use these 138 descriptors. We're going to get rid of the rest of them. We're going to merge these two that are kind of similar, right? Sulfur and sulfurous, garlic and garlicky. Some are obvious, some are less obvious.
So by curation, you mean coming up with sort of a standardized language that you were going to use to describe smell?
Exactly. And it mostly has to do with just aligning multiple data sets together, so that it uses a unified taxonomy, right? So that was the main work. And once you have that data set, you can train graph neural networks to take in the structure of a molecule and to predict what it smells like. And that seemed to work pretty well on our held out validation and test sets.
So let's just step back a second here for people who may not be completely familiar with machine learning and sort of bring this down to sort of an intuitive level, right? So when you say you used a graph neural net, let's just assume that people can visualize what a neural net looks like. So tell us how you go from molecular structure, which is not rectangular, but it's this sort of three-dimensional, thing with bonds and, molecules and, rather atoms and, stuff, how do you go from that to a neural net and then be able to predict what this thing will smell like?
Sure. So I'll give it a shot, and you tell me whether or not I'm hitting the right tone here or the right level. So a molecule can be any size, and we think what makes a molecule behave a certain way are pieces of the molecule contribute to some outcome, right? Maybe this piece that's sticking out in the molecule is actually what binds into a receptor and triggers the smell of orange, right? But we don't actually know which parts of the molecule are actually going to contribute to the smell percept. So we're going to let a model figure that out.
And by percept, you mean something like smoky or garlicky?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So like what little fragments or what motifs of molecules lead to a molecule more likely than not to smell a particular way? People for 100 years have guessed at what these parts are. And in general, like those guessing games don't really go that well. But we just want to learn that from data. So here's how you do it. What you do is you let every atom in the molecule talk to its neighbors, right? This is called message passing. So you start, imagine the molecule where there's just atoms are nodes, like nodes in a social network graph, and the bonds are edges, like friendships in a social network graph. And you let each node talk to the other nodes and gather information. And what that lets you do is each node no longer represents information about just that atom, but it can represent information about its neighborhood, right? So each node is no longer, in one round of message passing, a node is no longer an atom, it's a neighborhood. Now, if you do that one more time, each node in this graph now represents a bigger neighborhood. And you do it again, a bigger neighborhood, until every node basically has a picture over a pretty big chunk of the molecule. Now, those representations are really, really useful if what you think is true is that parts of the molecule contribute to some outcome, like what it smells like. So now the molecule is basically parts are talking to itself, and you have a representation that's kind of fuzzy little overlapping chunks of the molecule. You do something really dumb, which is you take all those representations and you just sum them together. And you pass that to a regular multi-layer perceptron, a regular feed-forward neural network, and you just predict, was that molecule actually smelling like orange and citrus and violet? And then you do backpropagation, which is a method to basically say, okay, if I made errors, how can I tweak the weights of the neural network to not make that error again? So the trick is this message passing step where you take a graph that has any size and you make the nodes in the graph represent regions, progressively larger regions over message passing steps. And then you destroy this funky sized graph by summing all that data together, and then you pass it to a regular neural network. So that's the trick. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, sort of small detail, when you sum them together, is that like a number, or is it like an array of numbers? Like
it'll be a vector. So it's up to you as the engineer of the system, like what kind of feature do you want in each of the nodes?
Right.
And that's a hyperparameter that you get to pick, and that's something you have to optimize based on some metric that you care about, right? You want to be accurate. So
it's almost like you're sort of first collecting information about the molecule that is each atom in the molecule. You're calling it a neighborhood, and then you're somehow sort of, I guess, would compressing it be appropriate, right? So you're compressing into this vector, passing it into a neural net, and saying, what is this? What smell percept does it correspond to? If it's wrong, it readjusts itself, and presto,
exactly.
Over many iterations, you learn how to, what the smell percept is that's associated with that molecule.
That's exactly it. And the devil is certainly in the details, but that's the general idea.
Yeah, lots of lots of devilish details involved in this. So, how much information do you need to like make this work? Right? Clearly, it's not going to work with 10 molecules. How many, do you need to sort of, get this thing to work where it's predicting, the odor associated with the molecule?
For reasons we don't really understand, the number of molecules you need for deep learning to start to work on a chemistry problem is about 1,000. And so if you have order thousands, then deep learning techniques are going to work better than older, simpler, and sometimes perfectly serviceable classic techniques. So the data set that we started with is 5,000 unique compounds and their odor labels. And that seems to work pretty darn well for making a model which can predict what a molecule smells like better than the average person can describe.
That's really interesting. So the neural net actually does a better job than most humans do.
So that was the big work that we did. That was what took a lot of time and was the focus of my group at Google, and really the basis upon which we spun out the company, is we did a double-blind human trial. So we actually predicted the smell of molecules that had never been smelled before. Some had never been even made before. And we kept those predictions secret, and we gave those molecules to a panel of people that were trained to label molecules according to 55 odor descriptors. And the best you can do is average a group of people who've been trained. So the panel average is the best. And our question was, is the model worse than the worst person? Or is it somewhere in the pack? Or does it start to exceed the average person? And the answer, surprisingly, was our model's predictions were closer to the panel mean than the average panelist. And what that means is if you're going to add a new panelist, so add a new person to a panel, you'd actually prefer to add the output of our ML model than you would to train another person. So that was a threshold of superhuman scent prediction performance, which we were able to pass, which I think is a milestone. There's so much more work to be done, but that when that result came out, when we finally understood it, that gave me a lot of hope that we were on the right track. Because I'll tell you, in smell, because so little is known, there's a lot of what I would just frankly call superstition about how hard the problem is. And I think all of the industries around smell, all of the studies around smell do not help this perception that smell is magical, it's mysterious, it's impenetrable. Maybe it's not even important, right? It's invisible, it's in the background. And I think it can be understood. The idea that we can actually look at a piece of the physical world and then predict what it's going to do to our entire brain, and then our verbal output system to say, hey, that smells like orange, that we can predict that from a molecular structure is crazy. And the fact that this works, to me, like lifted my hopes for the dream that I have to give computers a sense of smell. Because if we couldn't do this, then maybe the zeitgeist, like the general vibe amongst the people who study smell or work in it professionally, that smell is impenetrable and impossibly difficult to figure out, maybe that's wrong. And I think it is. I think that smell is understandable. I think we need data. And I think we are not going to figure out how to predict what things smell like at the molecular or the mixture level without AI.
Did you have mixtures, by the way, in your 5,000 sample?
In that data set, in that study, no. So we focused on just the simplest problem, which is one molecule. What does that molecule smell like? Because if we can't solve that simple problem, boy, like how are we going to move on to mixtures? So there's many mysteries that still remain. So the next hill to climb is, I think there's a general belief that mixtures are incredibly complex. And the relationship between the composition of a mixture and what it smells like is unpredictable and surprising. And I just would place another bet.
What do you think?
I think we can do it. Right? I'm forever an optimist, but the fact that we can do this to whatever level we were able to do with molecules throws the door open and says, no, smell is something we can tackle. And I don't see any reason why mixtures are going to, like the fact that there's multiple molecules interacting is necessarily going to be an insurmountable obstacle. It's going to add complexity for sure, but there's nothing that I can think of that says this is now an impossible problem to solve. So that's what we're up to.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard is about smell is that you have these sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, nasty nonlinearities, that especially around concentration. Right, that something, might smell like a strawberry at a concentration, and then it smells, like a grape at a higher concentration, and etc. So that's
for sure true, right? So there's all these edge cases in olfaction, and another edge case, as in like this is a weird thing that happens, and oh my gosh, it's complex. Do you know what a chiral pair is?
I do not.
So molecules can have their own mirror image, just like your left hand and your right hand are mirror images of each other.
Yeah.
There are molecules that have mirror images. And biologically, some drugs that are on the market are only effective in one of those mirror images. Right? So
are these like isomers? Or
yeah, they're stereoisomers.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, that's another name for them. So biology is sensitive to some, but not other pairs of these mirror images. And not surprisingly, some of these chiral pairs, these two molecules that are mirror images, don't smell the same. The question is, does it matter? There are famous examples of like the left-handed and right-handed version of a molecule called carvone, and one smells like caraway seed, the other smells like minty, and like they do smell different. They don't smell like crazily different. So I've smelled some of these stereoisomer pairs, and they're not like horribly different, but they're not the same. The question is like, does that matter for getting accurate predictions of smell? And the answer, at least in our case, is no. So our model is completely blind to this notion of there being mirror images. So we would never, ever get that right. That probably means there's some performance we left on the table, but we still were able to get superhuman scent prediction performance without it. So I think about these nonlinearities in mixtures, and I wonder how many of these specific examples of really hard nonlinearities we actually have to tackle. Can we ignore them? I don't know.
So if I sort of, I guess, extrapolate ahead, maybe a few years ahead, maybe we can actually predict what a mixture would smell like based on the sort of constituents that make it up and their concentrations.
I think that's entirely possible, right? I mean, like we have to do that at the company because we make molecules. That's part of our business. And so we need to know how they function, when we put them into a mix with other things.
By the way, I noticed that you have a lab over here where we're sitting. So what's going on back there? Is that what you're doing? Creating
we're
molecules?
making molecules. Yeah. So it's Willy Wonka's factory over there. Where there's new smells that are being created. Some things that have never been smelled before every single week are coming into that laboratory. And
so are you hiring people who are just like smell freaks, like really
So that's like one of my screens. So like if you interview for Osmo, like one of my secret rubrics, and you just tell me the right thing and increase the likelihood you get hired, is I want to hire people who are fanatics about smell. People who have harbored some love for smell and maybe even had to keep it secret and just have been waiting for the place to work where they can just obsess about smell. Even better if you're a fanatic about the idea that computers will have a sense of smell. So that's important to me, that you're just obsessed and fanatical about the mission that we're on.
Yeah. If I were 20 years old, I'd be lining up right there to get into that lab. Just sort of continuing with the science. So your approach really has been to sort of go from molecules to perception. What do you think about actually observing what's going on inside, looking at the apparatus, specifically, I guess, the bulb, or, I mean, where's the scope for actually looking at the neural part of our anatomy and adding to?
Yeah, it's a bigger conversation, which is like, what should the interaction between neuroscience and artificial intelligence be? And clearly they are intertwined, right? Like, people hop between these fields. I'm sure there's inspiration that has been instrumental in driving one or the other field forward. And we can name some specific examples. Like, I think Jim DiCarlo's work is amazing in this regard, where he's using AI to interrogate or explain different aspects of the visual system. And then I think it's fair to say that the, early successes of CNNs in ComNets in image classification came through inspiration from the nervous system, right? So I think it was the neocognitron, and I think that was the 70s or the 80s. So it's clearly a two-way street. That street takes a long road. It takes that street let me rephrase this. The connection between neuroscience and artificial intelligence is a road that takes a long time to travel in order for that information to productively interchange, right? So I think you're talking about timescales of like decades for information to productively transfer. I think people have the skills in one field to participate in the other, but insights, true like fact-finding missions in neuroscience take a long time to be practically useful in an engineering context. That's my opinion. So should both fields talk? 100%. Is it my opinion that the kind of science that I'm responsible for should directly be looking into the brain? Probably not. So I love talking to my fellow olfactory neuroscientists, but I don't think Osmo has any business doing that work ourselves, because I don't know how to turn that into practical advances on a timescale that matters for what it is that we're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. In fact, that's a nice segue into, Osmo and sort of the business side of smell. We can always come back to the science, but I'm just sort of curious about Osmo's mission, and what do you sort of see as the business of smell looking like at the moment, and also, as you project a few years?
So at the moment, it's pretty clear to write down where you can get paid for creating a smell. And it's in the flavor and fragrance industry, which is predominantly in New York and New Jersey, also in Switzerland. And they're in the business of designing fragrance molecules that smell beautiful and are performant, meaning they work in detergent or they work in hand soap, are affordable, and then blending those ingredients, those molecules together, sometimes also with naturals, so with natural distillates, to create beautiful fragrance experiences. And then those fragrances go in products like detergent or shampoo or a fine fragrance, and those products are then sold. And so where we have something special is that we're able to use artificial intelligence to design molecules that nobody's ever seen before. So very, very, at least to the fragrance industry, strange structures that perform very, very well and are affordable. And we think that we have something meaningful to contribute here, because not all the fragrance molecules that are out there really should be. So some of them are not biodegradable, meaning once they're flushed down the drain, they don't really go anywhere, right? They stick around in the soil and in fish, and they don't break down. And then some that have been taken off the market, and some that may in the future, are irritants to our skin. And so we think that there's room to use AI to rapidly improve it's called the palette. It's the group of all ingredients that a perfumer can use to make a fragrance, to rapidly improve the palette. And so we work on very targeted scent profiles, molecules or scents that are problematic for one reason or the other that need replacement. We use AI to design their replacement.
I guess put on my science fiction hat. Are we looking at a device a few years from now where you say, you press a button and you say, produce me that fragrance I smelled last year, which I miraculously captured in this bottle and now recreated for me? Is that kind of what we're...
That is where we're going. So that's not the first stop for our business, but that world where you can read scent, so you can capture scent with like a scent microphone, and then you can store it, manipulate it, play with it with a scent Photoshop, and then replay it with a scent printer. That world is going to exist. With or without Osmo, just being very frank, like that's the arc of human progress, is we take things that humans can do and we put them into computers and machines. Scent will be digitized. I just think we don't have to wait 50 years. We can do that in 5 or 10. If we really get everybody together and we say, we're going to do this, and we ask the questions in the right way, and we work on the right problems, and we get the right people and get everything right in terms of the organizational structure, and we work incredibly hard, we can bring that reality, that future possible reality, into today. So that's what we're working on, right? So we're trying to actually digitize smell. And so over the coming, let's call it year or two, we'll have more to share about what that looks like specifically. And but I'm thrilled to work on those kinds of problems. So we make molecules, but we also have this very, very future-looking part of the organization where we're actually trying to build the future.
So which government agency do you work with on this? What's the regulatory agency that regulates
for molecules? Right. So when you make a new fragrance molecule and you want to make a lot of it, you need to work with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And you propose your molecule to the EPA, you provide a data package that indicates that, it's safe environmentally, it's safe personally. And then the EPA reviews it and either give you feedback and you respond to it, or they say, all right, you're cleared to produce this much of this compound.
So what about the FDA? Do they get into it at all?
The FDA does for flavors. So fragrances you don't ingest. So it's not a food for the Food and Drug Administration. So the idea with it's my rationale, I could be wrong about this, but fragrances you put on your skin and then they float into the air. So it's more of an environmental concern than it is necessarily like an internal ingestion concern. But I don't really know the full history there.
Interesting. I was in California last month at this company called Upside Foods that makes artificial meat. And I don't eat meat, but I did make an exception there and tasted it. It was sort of interesting. But I was struck by the lack of aroma, in the food. I'm just curious, do you see, and I thought to myself, because I've sort of been, fairly deeply into smell for a couple of years. And I remember thinking like, wow, I think they could really do something there. Is that like a big space you see for this?
So in plant-based food, one of the major challenges, and this is me hearing from people who've worked in it. We actually employ several people who come from plant-based food companies. One of the major challenges is getting the smell right. Right. And this is ultimately a food problem. And so we focus on fragrance right now.
Yeah.
And so, we might in the future work on flavorants, but that's not on the current roadmap. Getting those flavor profiles and the aroma profiles of cooked meat is incredibly difficult. And it's actually, so again, I don't work in this, and so I'm telling you secondhand, but it's actually even harder than just, does it smell like the meat before it's cooked, right? Like raw meat. Mm-hmm. It has to smell like cooking meat. And then it has to smell like cooked meat.
Yeah.
And then when you put it in your mouth, it has to taste like it. So there's actually this whole time course that you have to get right. The engineering challenge to mimic that is immense, but some very, 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 very smart people are working on it. I don't think it's cracked. So just that's an example of like a frontier of flavor engineering that is still kind of open. And frankly, I don't even know if we understand the molecular content of these flavor profiles as deeply as we need in order to reverse engineer their smells. So there's even kind of technical problems with just understanding what meat smells like. That's still quite a challenge.
Yeah, so you don't see that happening in the next year or two?
I'd love to see it. I think that if we can do that for cultured meat or for lab grown meat, the mission behind those companies is really compelling. So I'd love for them to solve it.
Yeah. What are some of the other commercial opportunities in smell?
Oh boy. What's been interesting for us, and this was initially just a scientific curiosity, is I wondered if we can predict if a molecule smells good to a person, can we predict if it smells bad to an insect? And it turned out that worked. And it worked so well that we were able to design molecules that were as potent as DEET at repelling mosquitoes. And we did that work with the support and the encouragement of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we've continued that work, and the results are looking pretty good. But it's been a point of pride for me that we can actually use the platform that we built, the AI molecular engineering platform, to find molecules that might save lives. And that's been surprising for us, is that insect control might actually be an arena for us to play.
And by platform, say more? Like,
sure.
What does it look like?
When we make a prediction about whether a molecule is going to float in the air or stay in a solution, those predictions are just pieces of a much larger system. We predict many, many different properties all at once, and we actually make those predictions on many, 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 many molecules, and then we pick the ones that we think are going to do the best at a particular application. And the whole system that we've built at Osmo that stores all the molecules, allows us to search through them, make lots of predictions, train models, that's a platform. That's kind of our Scent operating system, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And that platform works phenomenally well at designing molecules that do what we want them to do perceptually. And it works well in humans. And now we have evidence it works well in insects.
Say a little bit more about what that molecule design process looks like. What do you start with? What do you have in mind here as the target?
Sure. So it's very, very important in all these things to start with a problem, right? Like, go to your customers and ask, like, what do you need? What is a molecule that you wish could be overhauled or wish could be changed in some way? What's problematic? And we listen very closely when our customers give us their answers. And we take those, we think about them, we rank them, and then we try to go to work. So if a customer says, we want a molecule that does A, B, and C, but not D, for whatever those definitions end up being, we're hard at work trying to find exactly that molecule. And then when we find it, we bring it to them. And we say, hey, we did it. What do you think? Right? And here's it working in this domain. Here's it working in that domain. And we go through a full demo. We show them that we've really understood the problem. And then we take the conversation from there.
So these are people in the food and fragrance industry?
That's right. Yeah. So people who are making products that require these molecules. Yeah.
So, I mean, would we like cookies and chips and stuff?
Well, that'd be in food, right? So for fragrance, it would be detergent, fabric softener, hand soap, shampoo, conditioner, fine fragrance, room spray, the smells in hotels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many, many different places that fragrance goes.
Are people like evaluating the success of these things, or is that really hard to do?
Everybody's going to do it a little bit differently. And what you want to do is pin the problem down as precisely as you can. So, and that's maybe a bit paradoxical with something that's as difficult to quantify as scent, but that's literally our job, is to try to make that as easy as possible. And we try to work on problems that have pretty clear quantitative definitions, right? It should smell like this. And then, all these other measurable quantitative properties should be true. Like, it should be biodegradable. It should not be an irritant. It should not, make your eyes hurt. It should have this vapor pressure. There's all these properties that you might want to optimize for. And so we do that.
So Alex, before we wrap up, I actually just want to come back to sort of the science part of it, because I was, at a talk you gave a few weeks ago at the Flatiron Institute, which is really about sort of the odor map, right? And as a contrast, you presented sort of the vision, map Tell us more about what we mean by, when you talk about an odor map. What does it look like?
So let's think about this from the perspective of vision, which is, and we see in red, green, and blue, more or less. And the reason why we see in red, green, and blue is because that's what the sun is giving us. Those are the wavelengths of light, or most of the wavelengths of light are in that range covered by red, green, and blue. So the statistical word for that is that's the prior over light. Yeah. What's the prior over smell? So that's really the question. And that, if you go back to the best perceptual neuroscientists like David Marr, if you look at Eero Simoncelli's papers and also Bruno Olshausen, there's always this concern over what's the prior over the sense. What is the world actually doing out there that the nervous system has to understand? Well, the air on Earth for the last 500 million years has been filled with oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, so lots of light gases. The rest of it is filled with life. It's filled with the molecules that are ejected from living beings. And so all the molecular diversity, all the really interesting looking molecules are created by life. And molecules are created by life in metabolic pathways, by enzymes that take in one molecule and produce another. And sometimes they stochastically produce one of two or one of three molecules. So if we're going to think about the prior for scent, we have to think about what generates those molecules. And what generates those molecules is life. It's the processes of life, the metabolome, the link of all enzymes that interconvert molecules in our bodies and in other living things' bodies, like plants, insects, fish. So that seems like a good starting place, right? And that's a theory that I have, a metabolic theory of odor, that what we're actually doing with smell is we're placing a smell on a coordinate system that is organized according to biological metabolism. And the proof for this is very light right now. One thing that we did in a paper in eLife is we just looked at whether or not two molecules that smelled similar were actually nearby in a metabolome. And the answer is that there's almost perfect correlation. There's great work by a researcher named Tanya Sharpie. And actually, this idea goes back even further. As a researcher by the name of Wright, I believe she's now at Oxford. There is a PhD student at Caltech named Chelsea Chi Reuter, I believe. But this idea that metabolism is the structure of smell is actually goes back, I think, over 25 years now. But that seems to be the only explanation that I've come across that makes sense to me, but maybe pun intended. And so what we've discovered with a neural network approach is we have a map, and the map is just learned from data. And it looks like that map aligns with, or at least distances in the map align with metabolism. What we don't have is the axes of that map don't have any meaning right now, right? So RGB, those are axes of color that definitely have meaning. We don't have a map that has meaningful axes yet. And so this is a frontier to me. This is like the current limits of our knowledge in scent, is that we would like a map. We'd like to know how many dimensions it is. Right now, our map is about 300 dimensional. That's just what the engineering tells us. It's coincidentally very close to the number of olfactory receptors in the human epithelium, right? I don't know if that's a real thing or it's just a coincidence. But we'd like a map where we know the number of dimensions and we know what the axes mean. And maybe the axes are, oh, this axis is combustion, it's flame. This axis is fermentation, it's breakdown by fungi. This axis is a metabolic process that only occurs in bark. So it's the woody axis, right? But I would like axes with biological meaning. And we just don't know. This is the frontier.
Very
right
interesting, yeah. So you're saying that the coordinate system of this, just like the coordinate system of light's driven by wavelengths striking us, the coordinate system of this is driven by metabolic pathways, like life generating smell.
That's what I think. Smell is the only sense where another living thing touches the inside of you, right? It touches your brain, literally. You know, your epithelium is your brain leaving your skull. So we're directly experiencing and tasting, sensing other living things when we smell them. And so I think it makes sense to understand smell through that lens, through the lens of life.
Yeah, yeah. And I can imagine that smells have probably changed over time as well. Like the way cities smell, maybe they smell different during the Industrial Revolution, or times when people were hawking, I don't know, leather on the street or something like that.
Boy, yeah, I think industrial processes over the past 200-300 years for sure changed the smellscape. But I could imagine that smell has been drifting over time as well. Like imagine a forest made of one kind of tree is replaced over time with another kind of tree that smells different, right? So if you're a little critter that lives in that area, your olfactory system has to adapt, at least over evolutionary time, to changes in the background and in what means that there's food nearby or there's predators nearby. But it all comes from living things. And so if you can build a sense which understands biological metabolism and how to interrelate or place smells on a coordinate roughly of where metabolically they come from, that's probably going to be useful no matter how the environment changes. And I think our sense of smell is still serving us, right? So, you have your experience of traveling through the world and smelling bread. We invented bread, but it's unique. It's its own smell that doesn't really occur, as far as we know, outside of bakeries where it originates. But our nose can smell it. Yeah. It was built for new things. And it's still working, and it's still bringing us joy, right? And still forming memories.
Well, Alex, this has been fascinating. I don't know where the time went, but, thanks so much for this conversation.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
super fun. This
really
is my favorite thing to talk about. I really enjoyed talking with you about it, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's fascinating to me. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I'm very happy to be sort of deeply involved in it. So we will definitely follow up and have another conversation. So
Lovely.
Thanks again.
Thank you.